Okay, I apologize. My last video, the something was wrong with the sound. It was cutting in and out, so I have to re-record this thing. And this is a pretty contentious topic, the topic of do lockdowns work? The whole purpose of lockdowns is to slow down the spread of the virus, and do they work or not? So there was this Newsweek article recently that said COVID lockdowns may have no clear benefit versus other voluntary measures international study shows. And if you look down here, the study is in the European Journal of Clinical Investigation. That is this study, um, assessing the mandatory stay-at-home orders and business closure effects on the spread of COVID-19. Okay, so let's open up the full text here. So the first thing to note about lockdown studies is that you can never get a clear 100% answer on whether lockdowns worked or not. Because in order to um, figure that out, you would need a perfect study. And when assessing these kinds of studies, it's important. It's kind of nice to think about what would a perfect study be, and see how close the studies that are studying the effects are to the perfect study. The perfect study would be you get 10 countries or 20 countries, so a certain number of countries. You need more than one and one in each group. So let's say, for example, 10 countries. In five of them, you have a lockdown, and in five, you don't. And the countries are exactly the same in every other respect. So you would have to like duplicate one country 10 times and then do it, because there's many other things that would affect whether or not a lock, affect the spread of the virus. Population density, culture of the country, the relative health status of the population of the country, the age distribution of the country. How much time do people spend with each other? Like if you have a culture where everyone kisses each other when they greet, you're more likely to spread the virus than in a culture where people, tend to bow to each other as a greeting and don't even shake hands. So a lot of things affect the rate of virus spread. So you would need identical countries where the virus hit them at the same time, so they're on the same curve of the exponential growth of the pandemic. So that they're at the same place on the curve, and then you put a lockdown in five of them and no lockdown on the other. That would definitively answer the question. Unfortunately, we don't have that scenario. We have a scenario where every country is slightly different in terms of population density, culture, health status, age distribution, all the millions of other factors that would affect that thing. So we're stuck with trying to parse out the effect of the lockdown in the midst of all these other confounding factors. And then the other thing that you have to think about in lockdown is it really doesn't matter what the government says to do. What matters is what people actually do. So if the government says we're going to lock down all the restaurants for in-person eating, but people still have dinner parties at their house, well, the lockdown really doesn't work because people are still doing the thing that they're trying to prevent, which is eating together in groups. They're just doing it at home. Um, so there's a lot of other factors that go into it. But the question is does government locking down do anything? And so in this study, um, they looked at that and they found the answer that they think that it is not. So when we're looking at a study, there's a couple of things that we need to consider when you have studies that say different things. You have to look at the authors. Do the authors have a bias? Because everyone's going to have a bias, and that's fine. Every person has a bias. And these two authors, the two senior authors, so in a paper, usually the beginning authors are the people that did the grunt work, and the senior authors are the ones that kind of thought up the study and kind of backed it up. The senior authors in this case are two well-known anti-lockdown people. They've been very critical of lockdowns ever since March, so they have a definite known bias, and that's fine. But you just have to understand that that is their bias and interpret the paper accordingly. And you don't just say, oh, the paper's no good because the author has a bias. You just have to say, well, let's look at the paper and look for ways that they might have biased it and look at the methodology and their conclusions. The other way you can think about it is look at the impact factor of the journal that it's published in. More higher impact factor journals tend to be a little more stringent in their editorial process. So this one was published in the European Journal of Clinical Investigation, has an impact factor of 3. And then the paper that this paper references is this Nature paper, and Nature has a impact factor of 43, so much higher. Okay, but let's go through this. What they did here is they estimate the case growth rate, so the rate of virus spread, using NPI. NPI stands for non-pharmacologic interventions in 10 countries. So England, France, Germany, Iran, Italy, Netherlands, Spain, South Korea, and Sweden. And so what they do is they look at these first 8 countries and they compare it against South Korea and Sweden. This is the other problem with these lockdown studies, is that there's essentially very few countries that did not institute a lockdown. So you don't have a very robust pool of countries in each group to choose from. For example, if we were to test a drug on everyone, and everyone took it except for these 2 people, and these 2 people happened to be the healthiest people, and they did fine without the drug, you could conclude that the drug didn't do anything, but it might just be that the 2 people that happened to not take the drug were just really healthy and didn't really need the drug. So that wouldn't mean the drug didn't work. It just, the sampling error was that way. So anyways, they conclude that South Korea and Sweden did not institute a lockdown, which, first of all, isn't true. Um, South Korea actually had a very stringent lockdown in the cities that were affected early on in the pandemic, and then afterwards they got a hold of the situation well enough. They instituted other measures other than lockdown, and those other measures were arguably more invasive than a lockdown. And those measures were, there was a mandatory 14-day quarantine for all international travelers. So if you fly into Korea, you stay in a hotel and you have to pay for this hotel for 2 weeks. You cannot leave your room. They have guards stationed in the hotel that you, not only can you not leave the hotel, you can't leave your room. They bring all your food. You install an app on your phone that tracks you, and then you have to check in with them with symptoms on that app, I think twice a day, and then you have to do a temperature check twice a day. And then after you leave, you still have the tracking device, and it tracks your movements. In case you turn up positive, they can track you down. Also, they had widespread testing in the country, and then widespread contact tracing, and they did contact tracing by phone GPS data as well as credit card information. And so they would be able to say, oh, this person bought a ticket to this movie theater on this date, and then they know everyone else who's in that movie theater, and they would text all of them and have them come in to get tested. So they did some very stringent quarantining and contact tracing in South Korea. So to say that they didn't have a lockdown or didn't have invasive non-pharmacologic measures, that's probably not an accurate statement. Sweden actually didn't lock down, and they were a well-known country that didn't lock down, but they did have voluntary measures, which they asked people to social distance, stay physically distant from each other. And so their population voluntarily did not eat in restaurants and have large gatherings and things like that. And that's very well known. They tracked cell phone data anonymously in Sweden, found out that people were not eating in restaurants nearly as much. And they just kind of voluntarily did the things that a lockdown would have implemented. So, basically lockdowns work as well as people comply with them. If you issue no lockdown measures, but everyone voluntarily does everything that the lockdown institutes, that's going to work great. It works better than having people locked down and then everyone ignores it and tries to circumvent it. Okay, so what they did is they looked at these 10 countries and they did an analysis, and they found out that it didn't make much of a difference. So the problems with this study are well, you know what? Let's find out what they say is the problem with this. Usually in the discussion section of a paper, people talk about what their potential problems are in their study. Okay, so here it is. Here's the part where they talk about it. While we find no evidence of large anti-contagion effects from mandatory stay-at-home and business closure policies, we should acknowledge that the underlying data and methods have important limitations. First, cross-country comparisons are difficult. So this is what we talked about. Countries have different rules, cultures, relationships between the government and citizenry. So, they understand that it's rife with sampling error. So, if you picked the 8 worst countries, and then you picked the two worst countries with lockdowns that had the worst compliance, and then you picked the two best countries who mandatorily did compliance. Who voluntarily people complied with lockdown measures that weren't even mandated, or they had rapid contact tracing and other measures that saved it. It's going to look really good. And ideally, remember, you would want to compare countries that are similar to the country that you wanted the two countries to be similar. So, like for Sweden, you would want to compare them to like Norway, Finland, other Nordic countries that have similar cultures and similar population densities. And if you do that comparison, Sweden clearly did worse than the other Nordic countries. In South Korea, you could compare them to other East Asian countries, and South Korea did not do worse, but the East Asian countries all had it pretty well under control. Taiwan is actually quite a bit better than South Korea, although I think South Korea handled it very, very well. And they did it through quarantining and contact tracing and massive amounts of testing early on so that they didn't have to go into lockdown. Okay, so this is the study that's in this study. Basically, they looked at. Oh yeah, there was one more problem with this paper. The other problem was is they looked at the countries at a specific point in time. So they looked at. Oh yeah, we estimate the unit growth effects of more restrictive non-pharmacologic interventions on case growth rates in the northern hemisphere spring of 2020. So they just looked at all the countries in a set time period. The problem with that is that the the virus hit different countries at different times. Remember, it hit China first, and then remember, Italy was hit very hard early, and then the UK was hit, and it hit Sweden later. So basically, you're assessing the countries in a set time period, but they're not at the same place in the pandemic. Ideally, you want to compare them at the same place in the pandemic, where they're at the same part of the curve. Okay, so in this paper, basically they looked at European countries that implemented non-pharmacologic measures and compared them to Sweden. This one's a little better because, the European countries are all going to have cultures that are more similar to Sweden than for, say, Iran or South Korea. Um, and in this paper, they found out that lockdown measures caused about 81% of the difference in virus growth. So basically, this paper is a little bit better in that they're closer to the ideal study, where they compared countries that basically have more similarity in terms of culture and population density and things like that. And so you eliminate more of the confounding factors. Again, you can't have there's arguments to be made for either paper because each paper has its problems. Like this one, also you can have a sampling problem. The European countries also hit their pandemic at different curves. You can cherry pick amongst the European countries. You could cherry pick the data so that you pick the people that are the best, the countries that did the best at doing the lockdowns, and you pick the country that did the worst at not implementing lockdowns and make it look good. Um, so there's always problems with sampling error, and in this case, since there's so few countries that didn't implement a lockdown, essentially it's just Sweden. It's very hard to make a good comparison. So this study is the question of do lockdowns work or not. That's extremely difficult to parse out at a population level. Now, if you just think about it mechanistically, though, if you were to separate everyone, like let's say you separated every single person on the planet for like a month from each other, you would 100% get rid of the pandemic because after the virus went through that one person, it would just have no other victims to get to. And it would just die. It would have run its course. But of course, that's impossible. People have families. There's critical jobs that need to be done. We still have to get water. We still have to get power. So you can't separate people. So lockdowns are a way of separating people as much as possible. They just decide like, oh, these are quote essential jobs and these are quote non-essential jobs. And of course, that's very arbitrary what's an essential and what's a non-essential job. But basically, they're trying to separate people as much as possible. Um, and if the idea is if you separate people more, there's less chance of the virus spreading, which just makes sense. But the problem is that if if you institute a lockdown and people don't want to do it, they will just circumvent it. And if you circumvent a lockdown, it just doesn't work. And basically, you just hurt businesses by doing that. Ideally, you would have people make up their own mind and decide what they want to do. Um, and that would work out great if a couple of situations, a couple of things were in effect. One, you had accurate information, so people were making good informed decisions. So in medicine, we have this idea of informed consent, where we give people good information and then they make a choice about what treatment they want. So if you want to let people decide, you need to give them accurate information, and that's been a big problem. That there has been kind of conflicting information, sensationalized information on one side, and then just minimizing the danger on the other side. So some people think it's like the worst thing ever, and everyone's going to die, and it's the end of the world as we know it. And other people think that it's no big deal, no one dies. These numbers are all made up. It's a big hoax. So just people just don't have accurate information. And then number two, if if their actions only affect if your action only affects you, then we should be free to do whatever we want. For example, like if you want to smoke, that's on you. You're just hurting yourself essentially. But if you smoke around other people, well, that then you can hurt them with secondhand smoke. So we don't allow that. So if the decision of people to carry on with their life and open businesses and go to restaurants and have parties, if that just affected them, I think that's fine. The problem being is that if the hospital systems are overloaded, which definitely happened in Italy and in New York City and more recently in California, then what happens is people that have other problems like cancer and trauma and just are heart attacks and strokes and sick for other reasons, they cannot get the care that they need as well because the hospital system and the healthcare system is overloaded from this. So if there was some way to mitigate that problem, um, I personally feel like we should let people do what they want. Um, but the problem is that if you overload the healthcare system, then you have kind of collateral damage from people that probably had been trying to follow the rules and things like that. So I think probably it just makes sense that lockdown measures work as long as people comply with them, and they probably worked early in the year. Early in the year, people were compliant, but now I think people have fatigue. They don't, they've been doing this for a year, and it's just not going to work anymore. People are tired of it. They're going to circumvent it, and I think it would have been much better handled by having accurate information, making people understand what the goals of physical separation are, so that and giving people the right amount of information about the relative risks of various activities and the risks to them, so that they can make a decision, and then try to mitigate the collateral damage by maybe figuring out some system where people that are following the rules get priority in treatment or something like that. But anyways, I think that these headlines like COVID lockdowns may have no clear benefit over other voluntary measures, international social. This is very, it's a little sensational, and it doesn't give any nuance to it. There are lots of papers that say that lockdowns don't work, and there's lots of papers that say lockdowns do work. Essentially, lockdowns work if people um, comply with them, and lockdowns don't work if people don't comply with them. And it's very hard to force compliance in a free society. And so I think, especially now at this point, lockdowns probably are not helpful because people just aren't. They're just fed up, and they're not going to comply as much. At least there's a large proportion of the population that is not going to comply, and you need basically the entire community to work together in order to stop the pandemic. So if a large proportion are not, then it's not effective. Okay, so I hope that was somewhat useful, and if you have any questions, comment below. Thanks for watching.